When my husband Frank Harold drained our entire life savings for his secretary, I smiled sweetly and signed the divorce papers he thrust at me. 6 months later, as he stood in our lawyer's office, gloating about keeping the house and his precious trust fund, I slid a manila envelope across the mahogany table. "Congratulations on your freedom, Frank," I said calmly. His triumphant smirk vanished as he read the infidelity clause documentation that would cost him everything he'd tried so hard to protect. The betrayal that ended my marriage didn't announce itself with dramatic flourishes or grand revelations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It arrived on a mundane Tuesday morning in March, wrapped in the ordinary routine of a 22-year partnership that I believed was built on mutual respect and shared dreams. I was Dorothy Harold, wife to Frank Harold, mother to our twin daughters Coral and Evelyn, and until that morning blissfully unaware that my entire adult life had been constructed on quicksand. Frank had left early for his law practice, kissing my forehead with the same perfunctory affection he'd shown for the past 5 years. The girls were at Northwestern University, Coral studying pre-med and Evelyn pursuing her MBA, both of them inheriting Frank's sharp intellect and my stubborn determination. Our colonial-style home in Kenilworth sat on 2 manicured acres, a testament to Frank's success as a corporate attorney and my careful management of our family's image and finances. That morning I was expecting the quarterly statement from our joint savings account, the one Frank and I had built together over 2 decades, funding it with his law firm bonuses and the substantial inheritance I'd received from my grandmother's estate. It was our security blanket, our children's future, our retirement dream of traveling through Europe and perhaps buying that cottage in Vermont we'd talked about during lazy Sunday mornings. Instead, I found myself staring at a balance that made my coffee cup slip from nerveless fingers, shattering against our marble kitchen floor, $847.23, $847.23, where there should have been $680,000. My first thought was identity theft. My second was bank error. My third, as I called our financial institution with trembling hands, was that surely this was some terrible mistake that would be resolved with a few phone calls and nervous laughter. The customer service representative, a patient woman named Linda, walked me through the account activity with professional sympathy that gradually became uncomfortable silence. "Mrs. Harold," she said carefully, "I'm showing a series of wire transfers over the past 8 months, all authorized with proper dual signatures, as required for your joint account. The largest was $150,000 in February, transferred to an account belonging to, let me see, Blanche Brooks." Blanche Brooks, I knew that name. Blanche Brooks was Frank's personal secretary, a petite brunette in her early 30s, who had worked at his firm for 3 years. She was efficient, professional, and always wore those tailored suits that somehow managed to be both appropriate and subtly alluring. During the firm's holiday parties, I'd watched her navigate conversations with clients and colleagues with impressive skill, and I'd felt proud that Frank had such a capable assistant supporting his practice. The irony of that pride would later make me physically ill. "I need copies of all transfer authorizations," I managed to say, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. "Every signature, every date, every transaction. Of course, Mrs. Harold. I'll have those prepared for pickup this afternoon. I'm very sorry about this situation." Linda's sympathy suggested she'd seen this story before, which somehow made it worse. I wasn't the first wife to discover her life savings had been systematically drained by a husband funding his affair. I was just another statistic in the endless catalog of marital betrayal, another woman who'd trusted completely and lost everything. After hanging up, I sat in our immaculate kitchen, the kitchen where Frank and I had planned our daughters' futures, where we'd discussed investment strategies and retirement dreams, where he'd held me after my grandmother's funeral and promised that her legacy would be protected and honored, and tried to process the magnitude of what I'd discovered. Frank hadn't just emptied our account, he'd done it methodically, carefully over 8 months. This wasn't an impulsive decision or a moment of weakness. This was systematic theft, planned and executed while he kissed me goodnight, and asked about my day, and helped Coral with her MCAT prep and attended Evelyn's business school presentations. The wire transfer records, which I collected that afternoon with hands that had stopped shaking from shock and started trembling with rage, told a story that was both heartbreaking and infuriating. February, $150,000 to Blanche Brooks. January, $95,000 to the same account. December, $80,000. November, $75,000. The amounts decreased as they went back in time, suggesting Frank had grown bolder or more desperate as his affair progressed. But there were other transfers too. Payments to luxury hotels in Chicago and New York, a $25,000 payment to Cartier, another $15,000 to a high-end travel agency that specialized in European getaways. Frank had been living a double life, funded entirely by the money we'd saved together for our family's future, the money that included my grandmother's inheritance that was meant to secure our children's education and our own retirement. That evening, when Frank returned home with his usual casual greeting and complaint about traffic on the North Shore, I watched him with new eyes. How could someone lie so comprehensively? How could he sit across from me at dinner, asking about my plans for the garden renovation, while knowing he'd just spent our daughter's graduate school fund on jewelry for his mistress? "How was your day, sweetheart?" he asked, loosening his tie as he reached for the wine bottle. "Enlightening," I replied, studying his face for any sign of guilt or recognition. There was nothing, just the same mild interest he'd shown for years, the same practiced routine of a man coming home to his wife after a day at the office. That night, as Frank slept peacefully beside me, how did he sleep so peacefully? I stared at the ceiling and began planning. 22 years of marriage had taught me many things about my husband, including his greatest weakness, his absolute conviction that he was the smartest person in any room. Frank's arrogance had served him well in corporate law, where confidence and calculated aggression won cases and impressed clients. But Frank had forgotten something crucial about our relationship, something that would prove to be his devastating miscalculation. 3 years into our marriage, when his law practice was struggling and my grandmother's inheritance represented financial security, Frank had insisted on establishing a joint trust fund with very specific provisions. He'd been particularly adamant about including an infidelity clause, not because he didn't trust me, he'd assured me, but because he'd seen too many wealthy men destroyed by unfaithful wives. "I'm not worried about you, Dorothy," he'd said, his arm around my waist as we signed the papers. "But I've represented enough men who lost everything to cheating wives. This protects us both." The clause was ironclad. Any spouse who committed adultery would forfeit their rights to the trust fund, which currently held $2.3 million in carefully invested assets. Frank had been so concerned about protecting his wealth from a potentially unfaithful wife that he'd created the perfect weapon for his own destruction. As I lay awake that night, listening to my cheating husband's steady breathing, I realized Frank was about to learn the most expensive lesson of his legal career. Always read the fine print, especially when you write it yourself. The moment that truly shattered my world didn't happen at the bank, or even during those first horrifying phone calls with customer service. It happened 3 days later, on a Friday afternoon at 2:47 p.m., in the most mundane of places, the dry cleaners on Green Bay Road. I had been moving through my days in a strange fog since discovering the empty account, maintaining the careful choreography of normalcy, while my mind raced through possibilities and plans. Frank had no idea I knew about the missing money. Each morning, he left for work with the same routine: coffee with 2 sugars, quick scan of the Wall Street Journal, perfunctory kiss on my cheek, completely oblivious to the fact that his 22-year deception had been exposed. I was picking up Frank's suits, 3 of them that he'd dropped off the previous week for his important client meetings in Detroit. The dry cleaner, Mrs. Chen, had known our family for 15 years. She always took special care with Frank's expensive suits, knowing how particular he was about his appearance in court. "Mrs. Harold," she said, as she retrieved the garments from the rotating rack, "I hope Mr. Harold enjoyed his trip to Paris. Such romantic city for anniversary celebration, yes?" My blood went cold. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" Mrs. Chen smiled warmly, clearly pleased to share in what she assumed was a lovely memory. "The stains on the burgundy suit, wine and, how you say, Lipstick. Very romantic stains from Paris restaurants, I think. I tell my husband Mr. Harold knows how to treat his wife special. The burgundy suit, Frank's most expensive suit. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The one he'd worn to what he claimed was a 3-day legal conference in Detroit just 2 weeks ago. The same weekend I'd stayed home with food poisoning, missing my book club's annual dinner that I'd been looking forward to for months. Yes, I managed to whisper, taking the suits with hands that had started trembling again. Very romantic, Mrs. Chen beamed, completely unaware that she'd just delivered the killing blow to whatever remained of my marriage. You lucky woman, Mrs. Harold. Not many husbands so thoughtful after so many years. I drove home in a daze, the suits hanging in my back seat like evidence in a crime scene. In our bedroom, I examined the burgundy suit with the methodical precision of a forensic investigator. The wine stains were faint but visible on the lapel. Red wine, expensive by the look of the deep burgundy color. But it was the lipstick that made me sink onto our bed, struggling to breathe. Coral pink passion. I knew that shade because I'd worn it myself for years, until Frank mentioned offhandedly that he preferred more subtle colors on women over 40. The lipstick on his suit collar wasn't subtle. It was bold, youthful, vibrant, exactly the kind of shade a 30-something secretary might wear to dinner in Paris with her married lover. Paris. While I'd been home with what I now realized was probably stress-induced illness, Frank had been strolling along the Seine with Blanche Brooks, drinking wine at sidewalk cafes, and creating the kind of romantic memories he and I hadn't shared in years. The $25,000 payment to the travel agency suddenly made perfect sense. It wasn't just a vacation, it was a declaration. Frank wasn't just having an affair, he was building a new life with her, funded entirely by our joint savings. I sat on our bed, surrounded by the trappings of our supposedly successful marriage, the matching furniture we'd picked out together, the family photos on the dresser, the wedding portrait that still hung above Frank's dresser, and tried to process the sheer audacity of what he'd done. He hadn't just stolen our money, he'd stolen experiences that should have been ours. Paris had been on our bucket list for 15 years. When the girls graduate, he'd always said, when the firm is more stable, when we have time to really enjoy it. Apparently, Frank had found the time, he just hadn't wanted to share it with his wife. That evening, I did something I'd never done in 22 years of marriage. I searched Frank's belongings, not frantically or desperately, but with the cold, systematic approach of someone gathering evidence. In his briefcase, I found nothing unusual, just legal documents and client files. His laptop was password protected, but I knew Frank well enough to guess. Coral level in 2001, the year our daughters were born. His email revealed a communication style I'd never seen before. Frank the husband was methodical, practical, occasionally affectionate in an understated way. Frank the lover was passionate, creative, almost poetic in his descriptions of their future together. Reading their exchanges was like discovering my husband had a secret twin, one who was capable of romance and spontaneity, and the kind of emotional intimacy Frank claimed to find exhausting in our marriage. The emails went back 14 months, starting with professional exchanges about scheduling and case files, gradually becoming more personal, then intimate, then explicitly romantic. But it was an email from just 3 days ago that stopped my breath entirely. My darling Blanche, the lawyer called today about the trust fund documentation. Everything is proceeding exactly as we discussed. Dorothy won't contest the divorce. She's too proud and too broken to fight. Once the decree is final, we can access the money and start our real life together. The cottage in Vermont you loved will be perfect for us. I can already picture you in the garden, wearing that blue dress you bought in Paris. Only 6 more months of this charade, and then we're free. The cottage in Vermont. Our cottage in Vermont, the one Frank and I had been planning to buy for our retirement. The blue dress from Paris, purchased with money he'd stolen from me. 6 more months of charade, that's what our marriage had become to him. But Frank had made a crucial error in his calculations. He was assuming I would react like the broken, passive woman he apparently thought I'd become after 22 years of marriage. He was assuming I didn't know about the money, about Paris, about any of it. Most importantly, He was assuming I'd forgotten about the trust fund provisions we'd established when we were young, and supposedly in love. Frank was about to discover that his wife was neither broken nor passive. And thanks to his own insistence on protecting his assets from an unfaithful spouse, I now held the power to destroy everything he'd worked so hard to steal. The next morning, I made 3 phone calls, one to a private investigator, one to a forensic accountant, and one to our estate attorney. It was time to remind Frank Harold exactly what he'd signed all those years ago. To understand the magnitude of Frank's betrayal, you need to understand what we had built together, or what I thought we had built together. The Harold family wasn't just successful, we were the picture of American achievement the couple other families aspired to become. Our life had been carefully curated over 2 decades, each piece fitting perfectly into the narrative of a power couple who had everything: love, money, brilliant children, and a future bright enough to blind anyone who looked too closely. Frank Harold wasn't born into wealth. His father had been a machinist at the Ford plant in Dearborn, his mother a part-time bookkeeper who cleaned offices on weekends to make ends meet. Frank clawed his way to Northwestern Law School on scholarships and sheer determination, working construction jobs during summers to pay for books and living expenses. When I met him at a law school mixer in 1999, he was wearing a suit from Goodwill that he'd had tailored to hide its thrift store origins. I fell in love with his hunger first, the way he studied like his life depended on it, because it did. Frank talked about corporate law not as a career choice, but as a rescue mission. He was going to save his parents from their financial struggles, buy his mother the house she'd always dreamed of, ensure his father could retire with dignity. His ambition was intoxicating because it felt noble, purposeful, directed towards something bigger than himself. My own background provided what Frank lacked: connections, polish, and most crucially, startup capital. My grandmother, Evelyn Ford, had been married to a man who'd made smart investments in telecommunications in the 1960s. When she passed during my second year of law school, she left me an inheritance that would have been life-changing for anyone, but for Frank, a man who'd never owned anything that hadn't been earned through sweat and sacrifice, it represented possibilities he'd never dared imagine. We married 6 months after graduation, a modest ceremony at my family's estate in Lake Forest. Frank's parents looked overwhelmed by the grandeur, while my family seemed charmed by Frank's earnest determination and obvious devotion to me. My father, who had built his own fortune in commercial real estate, pulled Frank aside during the reception and told him, "You're not marrying my daughter, son, you're joining our family business." The early years of our marriage were intoxicating. Frank established his practice with my grandmother's inheritance as seed money, while I worked at a boutique family law firm that specialized in high-net-worth divorces. We were partners in every sense. I reviewed his contracts, he helped me prep for difficult cases, and together we built something that felt unshakable. When Coral and Evelyn were born, we shifted our dynamic seamlessly. Frank's practice was booming. He'd become the go-to attorney for corporate acquisitions and mergers, while I transitioned to part-time work, then eventually stepped back entirely to manage our family's increasingly complex financial portfolio. It wasn't a sacrifice, it was strategic. Frank's earning potential was limitless, while my skills in investment management could maximize every dollar he brought home. By 2015, we were living the life we'd planned with obsessive precision. Our Kenilworth home was featured in Chicago Magazine's Power Couples issue, with photos of Frank in his study surrounded by legal awards, me in our garden with the girls, and both of us at the annual Children's Hospital Gala, where Frank served on the board. The article called us the perfect balance of ambition and family values, noting Frank's rise from working-class roots to legal prominence, and my family's 3-generation commitment to Chicago philanthropy. The girls thrived in this environment. Coral inherited Frank's analytical mind, and my family's sense of social responsibility, pursuing pre-med with plans to specialize in pediatric oncology. Evelyn combined Frank's strategic thinking with an entrepreneurial spirit that impressed even her business school professors. They were confident, accomplished young women who'd grown up believing that hard work and integrity would always be rewarded. Our social circle reflected our status: other successful couples who valued achievement, education, and discretion. We attended the right galas, supported the right causes, vacationed in the right places. Frank's partners at the firm included us in their exclusive ski trips to Aspen and wine tours through Napa. My charity work put us in contact with Chicago's most influential families, creating a network that benefited Frank's practice while satisfying my need to contribute meaningfully to our community. The financial structure we'd built was equally impressive. Beyond Frank's substantial income from the firm, we'd invested wisely in real estate, municipal bonds, and blue-chip stocks. The trust fund we'd established in 2004 had grown from my grandmother's inheritance into a $2.3 million portfolio that would ensure our daughters' futures and our own comfortable retirement. Frank's insistence on the infidelity clause had seemed almost romantic at the time. A man so devoted to his wife that he wanted legal assurance their partnership would be protected. "I've seen too many good men destroyed by unfaithful wives," he'd told our estate attorney. "I want Dorothy to know that our commitment is absolute, legally and morally." I'd signed those papers with complete confidence, even amusement. The idea of either of us betraying our partnership seemed impossible. We weren't just married, we were a corporation with 2 decades of successful operations and unlimited growth potential. From the outside, we had everything. Frank was respected in legal circles. I was admired for my charity work and investment acumen. Our daughters were thriving academically and socially. We owned properties in Chicago and Saugatuck, drove luxury cars, traveled internationally, and maintained friendships with people whose names appeared regularly in the Tribune's society pages. But sitting in our bedroom on that Friday night, holding Frank's burgundy suit and reading his love letters to another woman, I realized that our perfect life had been a performance. For Frank, our marriage had become a convenient facade that provided status, financial security, and social credibility while he pursued what he actually wanted with someone else. The most devastating part wasn't the affair itself, it was the methodical way Frank had dismantled everything we'd built while maintaining the appearance of devotion. He'd stolen our money, our dreams, our future, all while playing the role of dedicated husband at charity galas and family dinners. Frank had forgotten something crucial. I hadn't just helped build our perfect life, I'd designed the legal and financial foundations that protected it. And now, those same foundations would become the instruments of his destruction. The trust between Frank and me hadn't been built overnight. It was constructed through thousands of small moments, countless decisions where we chose partnership over self-interest, transparency over secrecy. Understanding how completely Frank had violated that trust required remembering how sacred it had once been between us. In the early days of our marriage, we operated as a true partnership in every sense. Frank would call me from the office before making any significant decision, not because he was required to, but because he valued my perspective. "Dorothy, I have a potential client who wants to pay our retainer in cryptocurrency. What do you think?" Or "the partners are discussing expanding to Milwaukee. Should we consider buying property there ourselves first?" I was more than Frank's wife. I was his closest advisor, his strategic partner, his intellectual equal. When he struggled with complex cases, we would spread documents across our dining room table and work through the legal challenges together. My background in family law gave me insights into relationship dynamics that often proved crucial in corporate negotiations where personal rivalries affected business decisions. Our financial partnership was even more intimate. We had one checking account, one savings account, and complete transparency about every expenditure over $50. Every month we would sit down with our statements and plan our financial future together. Frank would update me on the firm's performance and his projected bonuses, while I managed our investments and tracked our progress toward various goals. The girls' college funds, our retirement planning, the trust fund that would protect our family's wealth across generations. The decision-making process for major purchases was always collaborative. When we bought our Kenilworth home in 2006, we spent weeks walking through properties together, debating the merits of different neighborhoods, discussing how each house would affect our long-term financial picture. Frank trusted my instincts about the real estate market completely. "You have an eye for investment potential that I lack," he would say. "I can read contracts, but you can read futures." When it came to the girls' education, we were equally involved in every choice. Frank researched the academic reputations of various schools, while I evaluated their social environments and extracurricular programs. We interviewed teachers together, attended parent conferences as a team, and made decisions about summer programs and tutoring based on long discussions about what would best serve our daughters' futures. Our social calendar required similar coordination. Frank's firm hosted numerous events that required my presence as the polished wife who could navigate conversations with judges, corporate executives, and potential clients. I didn't just attend these functions, I strategically cultivated relationships that benefited Frank's practice. The wife of a federal judge became a close friend after we bonded over our shared interest in historic preservation. The CEO of a major manufacturing company started sending Frank business after his wife and I worked together on a literacy fundraiser. In return, Frank enthusiastically supported my charitable work, understanding that my board positions and volunteer leadership enhanced our family's reputation and expanded our network. When I wanted to donate significant amounts to organizations I was passionate about, Frank would review the tax implications and suggest optimal timing. "Your heart chooses the causes," he would say, "but let me help you maximize the impact." The establishment of our trust fund represented the pinnacle of this partnership. We spent months consulting with estate attorneys, financial advisors, and tax specialists to create a structure that would protect our wealth, minimize tax liability, and ensure our daughters' futures. Every clause was discussed and debated. Frank's insistence on the infidelity provision wasn't presented as a lack of trust in me, but as protection for both of us. "I've seen too many partnerships destroyed by betrayal," he explained, as we reviewed the documents. "This isn't about you specifically, Dorothy. It's about creating legal incentives that reinforce our moral commitments. Neither of us would ever be unfaithful, but having this clause makes our trust legally enforceable." I appreciated what I perceived as Frank's thoughtfulness in protecting our partnership through legal mechanisms. The clause felt like a romantic gesture, a man so committed to fidelity that he was willing to stake his financial future on it. We signed those papers with Frank's arm around my shoulders, both of us confident that we were building something unshakable. Our travel experiences reflected this same collaborative approach. Every vacation was planned together, with Frank researching activities and restaurants, while I handled logistics and budgeting. We had a shared bucket list of destinations we wanted to explore together: Paris in the springtime, the wine regions of Tuscany, the Christmas markets of Vienna. "When the girls are older," we would say. "When the firm is more established. When we have time to really savor these experiences together." The division of household responsibilities was similarly balanced and respectful. Frank handled home maintenance and insurance matters, while I managed interior design and landscaping. We shared cooking responsibilities, with Frank grilling on weekends while I prepared elaborate dinners for entertaining. Child-rearing duties were split according to our strengths. Frank helped with homework and attended science fairs, while I managed social calendars and coached the girls through relationship challenges. Even our individual friendships were transparent and inclusive. Frank's law school friends became our couple friends, while my college roommates and their husbands joined our regular dinner party rotation. We socialized as a unit, presenting a unified front in all our relationships. This level of integration and transparency made Frank's betrayal particularly devastating. He hadn't just cheated on me, he had systematically dismantled 22 years of partnership while maintaining the facade of collaboration. Every conversation about our financial goals had been a lie while he secretly drained our accounts. Every discussion about our retirement plans had been theater while he planned a future with someone else. The man who had insisted on legal protections against infidelity, who had presented himself as the guardian of our partnership's integrity, had spent over a year methodically violating every principle we had established together. Frank had used my trust, my transparency, and my financial expertise to facilitate his own betrayal. But in his arrogance, Frank had overlooked a crucial detail: the very trust fund he was planning to steal had been structured with his own paranoia about unfaithful wives. The legal mechanisms he had insisted upon to protect himself would now become the instruments of his complete financial destruction. Looking back with the clarity that only devastating betrayal can provide, I realized the signs had been there for over 18 months. Frank's transformation hadn't been sudden, it had been gradual, methodical, so subtle that I'd attributed each change to natural evolution in our long marriage, rather than evidence of systematic deception. The first shift I noticed was in our evening routines. For 20 years, Frank had been a creature of habit, home by 6:30, dinner together as a family when the girls lived at home, then quiet time in his study reviewing cases, while I managed household correspondence or read in the living room. We'd maintained this pattern even after Coral and Evelyn left for college, using dinner as our daily check-in about work, social obligations, and family matters. Around March of 2022, Frank began staying later at the office. "The Harrison merger is consuming everything," he'd explain, arriving home at 8 or 9 p.m. with takeout and apologies. "I'm sorry, sweetheart, but this deal could set the firm up for years." I was proud of his dedication and understanding about the demands of corporate law. What I didn't realize was that the Harrison merger had concluded in February. His phone habits changed too, though so gradually I barely noticed initially. Frank had always been disciplined about work-life boundaries, turning off his phone during dinner and leaving it in his study overnight. But suddenly, he was checking messages constantly during meals, while we watched television, even during conversations. "Clients expect immediate responses now," he'd say when I mentioned it. "The legal field has become so competitive, if I don't answer within an hour, they'll call another firm." The explanations were always reasonable, delivered with the same confident authority Frank used in courtrooms. When I suggested we establish phone-free zones like we had when the girls were teenagers, he dismissed the idea as impractical. "That worked when I was building the practice, Dorothy. Now I'm maintaining relationships worth millions." Physical intimacy became another casualty of Frank's alleged increased workload. We'd never been a particularly passionate couple, but we'd maintained a warm, comfortable physical connection throughout our marriage. Frank began claiming exhaustion, stress, the need for uninterrupted sleep before important meetings. Once this busy period passes, he'd promise, but the busy period seemed to extend indefinitely. The social changes were perhaps the most telling, though I misinterpreted them completely at the time. Frank had always enjoyed our dinner parties and charity events, using them strategically to build professional relationships. But starting in late 2022, he began suggesting we reduce our entertaining. "I'm tired of performing," he'd say. "Can't we just have quiet evenings at home?" Simultaneously, his work social calendar expanded dramatically. Firm retreats became monthly occurrences instead of quarterly. Client dinners required overnight trips to restaurants in Milwaukee or Indianapolis that seemed unnecessarily distant for business meals. Golf outings with partners extended to entire weekends. "Building relationships is crucial at this level," Frank would explain. "The partners who don't invest in FaceTime get left behind." When I offered to accompany him to these events, as I had for years, Frank would decline with perfectly logical reasons. "This is just boring shop talk, Dorothy. You'd be miserable." Or, "The other wives aren't coming. It's really just a working dinner disguised as socializing." Financial discussions, once the cornerstone of our partnership, became increasingly one-sided. Frank would still update me on major firm developments and his projected income, but when I wanted to review our investment strategy or discuss large expenditures, he'd defer the conversations. "Let's wait until the end of the quarter when I have a clearer picture," he'd say. "The market's too volatile right now for major decisions." I found myself handling more of the household financial management without Frank's input, which he presented as a gift of trust in my capabilities. "You've always been better with the day-to-day money management," he'd say. "I'll focus on earning it, you focus on optimizing it." What I interpreted as confidence in my financial skills was actually Frank's way of reducing his oversight of accounts he was systematically draining. Even his appearance began changing in ways I attributed to midlife confidence, rather than infidelity. Frank started working out more regularly, claiming stress relief and health concerns. He updated his wardrobe with more fashionable suits and accessories, explaining that his elevated position at the firm required a more polished image. "Image matters at this level," he'd say, admiring himself in our bedroom mirror. Clients expect their attorney to look successful. The most painful sign in retrospect was how Frank began treating our shared dreams. Our plans for European travel, the Vermont cottage, the cultural activities we'd enjoy in retirement. Frank started discussing these with detachment rather than enthusiasm. We should be realistic about what we actually want, versus what we think we should want, he'd say. When I'd mention our travel bucket list, maybe we're too set in our ways for major adventures. What I heard as mature reflection on our changing priorities was actually Frank's way of distancing himself from a future he no longer intended to share with me. Every dismissal of our joint plans was a step toward the separate life he was building with Blanche, funded by the money we'd saved together for those very dreams. The cruelest irony was that I interpreted many of these changes as evidence of Frank's continued growth and success. I was proud of his expanding client base, understanding about his increased stress levels, supportive of his need for professional development. I was quite literally enabling my own betrayal while congratulating myself on being a supportive wife to an ambitious husband. If I had connected these individual changes into a pattern, if I had trusted my instincts instead of Frank's explanations, I might have discovered his affair before he'd stolen our entire life savings. But Frank knew exactly how to exploit my trust, my pride in his success, and my commitment to our partnership, to blind me to what was happening right in front of me. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that usually filled me with energy and optimism. Frank was in his study, ostensibly preparing for a Monday morning deposition, while I sat in our kitchen with the evidence of his betrayal spread across our marble island, bank statements, the burgundy suit hanging from the pantry door, printed emails, and photographs from the private investigator I'd hired 3 days earlier. My hands were steady now. The initial shock had crystallized into something harder, more focused. I'd spent the night rehearsing this conversation, anticipating Frank's responses, preparing for the deflection and gaslighting. I now realized he'd been practicing on me for months. What I hadn't prepared for was the complete absence of shame in his reaction. "Frank," I called out, my voice carrying the same casual tone I'd used to call him for dinner thousands of times before. "Could you come to the kitchen for a moment? I need to discuss something with you." He appeared in the doorway wearing his favorite weekend outfit, khakis and a navy cashmere sweater I'd given him last Christmas. For a split second, looking at him in the morning light streaming through our windows, I felt a ghost of the affection that had sustained our marriage for over 2 decades. Then I remembered the lipstick on his collar and the feeling vanished. "What's all this?" Frank asked, noting the papers spread across the counter. His tone was mildly curious, the way he might ask about mail or grocery lists. No anxiety, no recognition, no guilt. "Our bank statements," I replied, holding up the quarterly summary. "I thought we should review them together. There seem to be some significant withdrawals I don't remember discussing." Frank glanced at the papers with the same casual interest he'd shown when I'd asked him about household repairs or social calendar conflicts. "Dorothy, we've been through this. I handle the major financial decisions. If you're concerned about something specific, just ask me directly." The condescension in his voice, patient, slightly amused, as if I were a child asking about adult matters, ignited something cold and furious in my chest. This was the tone Frank used with difficult clients, with opposing counsel, with anyone he considered intellectually inferior. "I am asking you directly," I said, spreading the bank statements out systematically. $850,000 transferred to Blanche Brooks over the past 14 months. I'd like you to explain those transactions. For the first time, Frank's expression shifted, not to guilt or shame, but to calculation. I watched him assess the situation, with the same analytical approach he used for legal strategy. How much did I know? How much could he still control? "Blanche has been handling some investments for the firm," he said smoothly. "Complex financial instruments that require specialized accounts. I should have mentioned it, but frankly, the details would bore you." The lie was delivered with such confidence, such casual authority, that I almost doubted my own evidence. This was Frank's superpower, his ability to make reality bend to his narrative through sheer force of conviction. "Investments," I repeated slowly. "Is that what you call the $25,000 payment to the travel agency?" The 15,000 to Cartier? The hotel charges in Paris when you were supposedly in Detroit? Frank's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. You've been spying on me. I've been trying to understand why our life savings disappeared while my husband lied to my face about business trips. I pulled out the private investigator's photographs. Frank and Blanche at a sidewalk cafe in Montmartre, her wearing the diamond bracelet he'd claimed was a gift for my upcoming birthday. Is this part of the firm's investment strategy too? The transformation in Frank's demeanor was instantaneous and chilling. The patient, slightly condescending husband vanished, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. His eyes went cold, his posture shifted to the aggressive stance he used in hostile negotiations. You have no idea what you're interfering with, he said, his voice dropping to the tone he reserved for adversaries. I've been building something important, something that will secure our future in ways you can't comprehend. Our future? I couldn't keep the bitter laugh out of my voice. Frank, you've stolen nearly $1 million from our joint accounts to fund an affair with your secretary. What part of that secures our future? Blanche isn't just my secretary, he snapped, abandoning any pretense of denial. She's brilliant, ambitious, young enough to appreciate what I've accomplished. She understands the law, understands business, understands what it takes to succeed at the highest levels. The casual cruelty of his words, the implication that I lacked the intelligence or ambition to appreciate his success, was devastating in its matter-of-factness. Frank wasn't confessing, he was explaining why his betrayal was justified. I want a divorce, he continued, as if announcing a business decision. I've already consulted with Stanley Brooks, no relation to Blanche, about the most efficient way to dissolve our marriage. You'll be comfortable, Dorothy. The house, a reasonable settlement, enough to maintain your lifestyle, but I need to move forward with my life. I stared at this stranger wearing my husband's face, marveling at his complete absence of guilt or remorse. Frank had planned this conversation, possibly for months. He'd stolen our money, spent it on another woman, and now expected me to graciously accept whatever scraps he was willing to offer. And the trust fund? I asked quietly. Frank's smile was genuinely pleased, as if I'd finally asked an intelligent question. The trust fund will remain intact, of course. For our financial security, and the girl's inheritance. Nothing about this needs to affect our long-term wealth management. He had no idea. After 22 years of marriage, countless legal documents reviewed together, endless conversations about protecting our assets, Frank had completely forgotten about the infidelity clause he'd insisted upon. Or perhaps he'd simply assumed that his own careful planning made discovery impossible. I see, I said, gathering the papers with hands that no longer trembled. I'll need some time to process this, Frank. This is quite a lot to absorb. His relief was palpable. Of course, take all the time you need. There's no rush, I just wanted everything out in the open between us. As Frank returned to his study, probably to call Blanche and report that his wife had taken the news better than expected, I sat alone in our kitchen and began planning his complete destruction. The hours after Frank returned to his study felt like standing in the eye of a hurricane. Everything appeared calm on the surface, Frank typing away at his computer, the house settling into its familiar Saturday afternoon quiet, the autumn sun streaming through our windows, as if nothing had fundamentally changed. But beneath that deceptive tranquility, I was processing the complete destruction of everything I'd believed about my life. Frank thought he'd won. His relief had been obvious when I'd appeared to accept his explanation with quiet resignation. In his mind, he'd successfully managed a potentially explosive situation, convinced his naive wife to accept his version of reality, and cleared the path for his new life with Blanche. What Frank didn't understand was that his casual cruelty during our confrontation had transformed me from a hurt wife into something far more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose and every reason to fight. I sat at our kitchen table, staring at the evidence of Frank's betrayal, and felt something clicking into place inside my mind. For the first time in months, I wasn't confused or uncertain. The fog of self-doubt that had been clouding my judgment cleared completely, replaced by a crystalline focus I recognized from my law school days when I'd been known for my surgical approach to complex cases. Frank had made several critical errors during our confrontation, each one revealing just how completely he'd underestimated me. First, he'd admitted to the affair and the financial theft without any apparent concern about legal consequences. Second, he'd assumed I would accept his version of our divorce settlement without investigating my own options. Most crucially, he'd demonstrated complete ignorance about the very legal documents he'd insisted upon creating. The irony was almost beautiful. Frank, the brilliant corporate attorney who built his reputation on reading contracts with microscopic attention to detail, had forgotten about the most important clause in our most significant legal document. The infidelity provision in our trust fund wasn't just a moral safeguard, it was a financial nuclear weapon that Frank had handed me himself. But I needed more than just the trust fund clause to destroy him completely. Frank's confession about the affair was a start, but I needed documented proof that would stand up in court. His casual dismissal of our marriage deserved consequences that went beyond simple divorce proceedings. If Frank wanted to rebuild his life with Blanche using stolen money, I was going to ensure that his professional reputation, his financial security, and his arrogant certainty about controlling this situation were dismantled piece by piece. I pulled out my phone and made the first call to Omar Sterling, the private investigator I'd hired earlier in the week. Omar, it's Dorothy Harold. I need to accelerate our timeline significantly. I want everything you can find on the affair, the financial transfers, and any other evidence of misconduct. Money is no object. Omar's voice carried the satisfaction of a professional who'd been hoping for exactly this conversation. Mrs. Harold, I was hoping you'd say that. I've already uncovered some interesting connections between your husband's firm and Miss Brooks that go beyond their personal relationship. Are you prepared for this to get complicated? Complicated is exactly what I want, I replied. Frank thinks he's the smartest person in every room. It's time to prove him wrong. The second call went to Linda Morrison, a forensic accountant who'd worked on several high-profile divorce cases in Chicago. I'd met her at various charity functions over the years, always impressed by her reputation for uncovering hidden assets and financial manipulation. Linda, this is Dorothy Harold. I need your expertise for what I suspect is a complex financial fraud case disguised as marital assets. Linda's response was immediate and professional. Dorothy, I remember you from the Children's Hospital Board. How quickly do you need results? Immediately. I want every transaction traced, every account identified, every dollar accounted for. I suspect there are assets and expenditures that haven't been disclosed to me, and I want a complete financial reconstruction of the past 2 years. The third call was the most important. Stanley Brooks, our estate attorney who had drafted the trust fund documents. The irony that Frank had consulted with another Brooks about the divorce wasn't lost on me, but I needed to speak with the lawyer who actually understood our legal situation. Stanley, it's Dorothy Harold. I need to schedule an emergency consultation about our trust fund provisions. Specifically, I need you to explain exactly how the infidelity clause would be enforced if one spouse violated the terms. Stanley's pause was telling. Dorothy, has something happened that I should know about? Frank has been having an affair for over a year and has stolen nearly $1 million from our joint accounts to fund his relationship with his secretary. I want to understand every legal option available to me. My God, Stanley breathed. Dorothy, Frank called me last week asking about divorce procedures. He never mentioned any of this. Are you certain about these allegations? I have photographs, bank records, and Frank's own admission. Stanley, I want him destroyed legally and financially. What can the trust fund clause do to him? Stanley's voice took on the focused intensity of a lawyer who'd just been handed a case with perfect facts. Dorothy, if we can prove adultery and financial misconduct, Frank won't just lose his share of the trust fund. There are additional provisions about restitution and legal costs that could bankrupt him entirely. Can you be in my office Monday morning? After hanging up, I sat in our kitchen and felt a sense of purpose I hadn't experienced in years. Frank thought he'd managed me expertly, convinced that his superior intelligence and legal training gave him an insurmountable advantage. What he'd failed to consider was that I'd been managing complex situations and difficult people my entire adult life. I'd just been doing it in support of our marriage rather than in opposition to it. Frank wanted a divorce. He was going to get one that would serve as a cautionary tale for every unfaithful spouse in Chicago. By the time I was finished, his affair with Blanche would be the most expensive mistake of his professional life. The hunter had become the hunted, and Frank didn't even know the game had begun. Monday morning arrived with the kind of sharp clarity that follows life-altering decisions. While Frank prepared for his day with the same routine confidence he'd maintained throughout his deception, I was beginning the systematic dismantling of everything he'd stolen from me. The difference was that Frank thought he was heading to another ordinary day at the office, while I knew I was starting a war. My first meeting was with Omar Sterling at his discreet office in downtown Evanston. Omar had built his reputation handling sensitive investigations for Chicago's wealthy families, and his client list read like a who's who of corporate executives and old money dynasties. What impressed me immediately was his methodical approach to evidence gathering. Mrs. Harold, Omar began, spreading photographs across his conference table. Your husband and Miss Brooks have been surprisingly careless about their activities. They've established patterns that make surveillance straightforward. The photographs told a story of a couple completely comfortable with their deception. Frank and Blanche at the Ritz-Carlton bar on Tuesday afternoons, her hand on his thigh while he laughed at something she'd said. The two of them entering a luxury apartment building in River North that I'd never seen before. Blanche wearing the emerald earrings Frank had supposedly returned to the jeweler because they weren't quite right for me. This apartment, I said, pointing to the building in the photographs. What do we know about it? Omar pulled out a lease agreement, signed 6 months ago. Monthly rent is $4,200, paid from an account in your husband's name. It's listed as a corporate housing for visiting clients, but the lease is for 2 years and the furnishings suggest permanent residence. The apartment represented everything Frank had claimed he couldn't afford for our family. When I'd suggested updating our outdated kitchen, he'd insisted we needed to be more conservative with spending. When the girls had wanted to study abroad, he'd calculated every penny to demonstrate how the expenses would strain our budget. But he'd been perfectly comfortable spending over $50,000 annually on a love nest for his mistress. There's more, Omar continued, opening another file. Miss Brooks has been receiving regular payments from the firm for consulting services that don't correspond to any actual work. $5,000 monthly for client relationship management and administrative consulting. I've verified with other employees that she's never performed these services. This revelation hit differently than the personal betrayal. Frank wasn't just cheating on me, he was defrauding his own law firm using partnership funds to pay his mistress for non-existent work. The partners who trusted Frank, who'd elevated him to his current position, were unknowingly funding his affair. Omar, I need you to document every financial transaction between Frank and Blanche, every professional interaction, every gift or payment that crosses the line between legitimate business and personal relationship. I want a timeline that shows exactly when this shifted from workplace interaction to systematic fraud. My next stop was Linda Morrison's office, where the forensic accounting review had already begun yielding disturbing results. Linda had the kind of sharp analytical mind that could trace financial patterns through layers of obfuscation and deliberate misdirection. Dorothy, your husband is more sophisticated than most unfaithful spouses, Linda explained, pointing to spreadsheets that tracked money flows across multiple accounts. He's created a complex web of transfers designed to obscure the ultimate destinations of your joint funds. The pattern was clear once Linda mapped it out. Money would flow from our joint savings to Frank's business account, then to various LLC entities he'd established, then finally to Blanche through multiple smaller payments that would be harder to trace. Frank had used his legal expertise to create a money laundering scheme that funneled our assets to his mistress, while maintaining plausible explanations for each individual transaction. But here's what's interesting, Linda continued, opening another file. These LLC entities Frank created, they're supposed to be legitimate business ventures. I've found incorporation documents, business plans, even loan applications. Frank wasn't just stealing money, he was creating fictional businesses to justify the thefts. This discovery transformed my understanding of Frank's betrayal entirely. This wasn't a crime of passion or emotional weakness. Frank had spent months, possibly years, constructing an elaborate financial infrastructure designed to systematically steal from our marriage, while maintaining legal cover for his actions. Linda, how much are we talking about total? Not just the obvious transfers, but everything that flows through this network. Her answer made me grip the edge of her desk. Conservative estimate: $1.4 million over the past 18 months. That includes your joint savings, investment account liquidations you weren't aware of, and what appears to be a second mortgage on your home that was never disclosed to you. Frank had mortgaged our house, the home I'd lived in for 15 years, that I'd decorated and maintained and loved, was now encumbered with debt I'd never agreed to. He'd literally stolen the roof over my head to fund his affair. There's one more thing, Linda said quietly. The loan applications for these business ventures list you as a co-signer and guarantor. Frank forged your signature on multiple financial documents. This isn't just adultery and theft, it's identity fraud and forgery. I sat in Linda's office, staring at evidence that Frank had committed multiple felonies, while maintaining the facade of loving husband. Every signature he'd forged, every document he'd falsified, every dollar he'd stolen added another layer to the legal case that was building against him. Frank thought he was smarter than everyone around him, including me, but his arrogance had led him to create a documented trail of criminal activity that stretched back over a year. The very legal expertise he was so proud of had been turned toward creating evidence of his own destruction. By the time I left Linda's office, I wasn't just planning a divorce, I was planning to ensure that Frank's affair would cost him his freedom, his profession, and every penny he'd tried to steal from our marriage. The revelation that fundamentally changed everything came during my third meeting with Omar Sterling, exactly 1 week after I'd discovered the empty bank account. I thought I understood the scope of Frank's betrayal, an affair, financial theft, professional misconduct. What Omar revealed that Wednesday afternoon showed me I'd been seeing only the surface of something far more extensive and disturbing. "Mrs. Harold," Omar said, his expression grave as he opened a thick file, "I need to prepare you for what I'm about to show you. This situation involves more people than just your husband and Miss Brooks." The first photograph stopped my breath completely. Frank and Blanche weren't alone at the restaurant table, they were dining with another couple I recognized immediately. Stanley's partner at the law firm, Lionel Ford, and his wife Evelyn, who served on the hospital board with me. The timestamp showed the dinner had occurred just 3 weeks ago, while I'd been home with what I'd thought was a stomach flu. "This gets complicated," Omar continued, producing more surveillance photos. "Mr. Ford appears to be involved in whatever business arrangements your husband has created. These aren't social dinners, they're planning meetings." The images painted a picture of systematic coordination. Lionel Ford meeting with Frank at various locations around the city, documents being exchanged, briefcases passed between cars in parking garages, phone calls made from secure locations. This wasn't just an affair, it was a conspiracy. "Omar, please tell me you've identified what they're planning." His next revelation was devastating. "Mrs. Harold, I believe your husband and Mr. Ford have been systematically defrauding multiple clients through the same network of shell companies. Miss Brooks isn't just Mr. Harold's mistress, she appears to be the financial coordinator for an extensive embezzlement operation." Omar spread out corporate documents, bank records, and correspondence that revealed a stunning pattern. Frank and Lionel had been using their positions at the law firm to identify wealthy clients with complex financial situations, then creating investment opportunities that didn't actually exist. Client money flowed into the same LLC network Frank had used to steal from our marriage, then disappeared into accounts controlled by Blanche. "How many clients are we talking about?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "At least 12 that I've identified so far. Total funds missing appear to exceed $8 million. Harold, your husband isn't just a cheating spouse, he's been running a Ponzi scheme using his law practice as cover." The scope of criminality was breathtaking. Frank had used his reputation, his professional relationships, and his access to confidential client information to construct an elaborate fraud that had been operating for over 2 years. The affair with Blanche wasn't a midlife crisis, it was a criminal partnership disguised as romance. "There's something else," Omar continued reluctantly. "I've identified at least 3 other women who appear to have romantic relationships with men involved in this network. It's possible that these affairs aren't coincidental, they might be part of the operational structure." This revelation shattered my last remaining illusions about Frank's betrayal being personal or emotional. If Omar was correct, Frank hadn't fallen in love with Blanche despite being married to me. He'd cultivated their relationship specifically because it served the criminal enterprise they were building together. Mrs. Harold, I need to ask you some difficult questions about your own involvement in the firm's activities. Have you ever signed documents or attended meetings where investments were discussed? Any situation where your presence might have provided legitimacy to transactions you weren't fully aware of? The question triggered a cascade of memories that suddenly took on sinister significance. Charity events where Frank had introduced me to clients as his brilliant wife, who managed all our family investments. Social dinners where business conversations had continued longer than usual, with Frank suggesting I share my perspective on financial markets. Casual signatures on documents Frank claimed were routine tax or insurance paperwork. Oh God, I whispered, understanding dawning. Frank's been using me as unknowing cover for his criminal activities. Omar nodded grimly. Your reputation in the community, your charity work, your family background, all of it provided credibility that helped Frank convince clients to trust him with their money. You weren't just his wife, Mrs. Harold. You were, unknowingly, part of his marketing strategy. The personal betrayal was devastating enough, but this revelation added a layer of professional and legal jeopardy that terrified me. If authorities investigated Frank's activities, would I be considered an accomplice? Would my ignorance of his crimes be believable, or would investigators assume I'd been complicit in stealing millions from his clients? Omar, I need to understand my legal exposure immediately. If Frank has been using my reputation to facilitate fraud, what position does that put me in legally? That's exactly what I was hoping you'd ask, he replied, producing another file. I've been working with a federal investigator who specializes in white-collar crime. Agent Sarah Chen from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit has been building a case against networks exactly like this one. She needs someone with inside access to Frank's activities. The implications hit me like physical blows. The FBI was already investigating Frank. My husband wasn't just a lying, cheating embezzler. He was under federal surveillance for crimes that could send him to prison for decades. And now Agent Chen wanted me to become an informant against my own husband. Mrs. Harold, I need you to understand something crucial. If you cooperate with the federal investigation, you'll receive immunity for any unknowing participation in Frank's crimes. But if you don't cooperate, and they proceed with charges, you could be indicted alongside him. I sat in Omar's office, staring at photographs of my husband conducting criminal business with people I'd considered friends, and realized that Frank's betrayal extended far beyond our marriage. He'd endangered our daughter's futures, our family's reputation, and my personal freedom. Every social interaction, every charity event, every dinner party had potentially been cover for systematic fraud. Frank thought he was building a new life with Blanche while keeping me safely contained in ignorance. What he'd actually done was create the perfect conditions for his own complete destruction, and handed me the opportunity to be the instrument of that destruction, while protecting myself and our daughters from the fallout of his crimes. The decision to cooperate with Agent Chen was easy. Frank had forfeited any claim to my loyalty the moment he'd put our family at legal risk to fund his criminal activities. If he wanted to destroy everything we'd built together, I was going to ensure he did it alone. The meeting with FBI agent Sarah Chen took place in a nondescript office building in downtown Chicago, far from the social circles where Frank and I were known. What I expected was a clinical discussion of financial crimes and legal procedures. What I discovered was that Frank's betrayal had personal dimensions that made his theft of money seem almost trivial by comparison. Agent Chen was younger than I'd anticipated, probably in her early 40s, with the kind of sharp focus that comes from years of untangling complex white-collar crimes. But when she opened Frank's file, her expression carried a weight that suggested this case had affected her personally. Mrs. Harold, before we discuss your husband's financial crimes, I need to share something that will be difficult to hear. Your cooperation is crucial, not just for the fraud investigation, but for protecting other victims who don't yet know they've been targeted. She slid a photograph across the table that made my blood run cold. It was taken at our anniversary party 2 years ago, the elegant dinner Frank had thrown at the university club to celebrate 20 years of marriage. I remembered the evening fondly, close friends, family, heartfelt toasts about our enduring partnership. In the photograph, Frank was speaking with Margaret Reynolds, the surgeon's wife I'd known for over a decade. Mrs. Reynolds lost her husband to cancer 8 months ago, Agent Chen explained quietly. She's been working with your husband to invest her life insurance settlement and retirement funds. She trusts him completely because of your friendship and your family's reputation in the community. The implication hit me like a physical blow. Margaret, who'd called me crying when her husband died, who'd leaned on our friendship during the darkest period of her life, was being systematically defrauded by my husband. Frank was using my relationship with her, built over years of genuine care and shared experiences, to steal from a grieving widow. How much? I whispered. Everything. Her entire life insurance payout, her retirement savings, even the proceeds from selling their family home. Mrs. Reynolds has been living off credit cards for 3 months because she believes her money is safely invested in opportunities your husband recommended. Agent Chen produced more photographs from social events, I remembered clearly. The Children's Hospital Gala where Frank had been honored for our family's charitable contributions. The Art Museum fundraiser where I'd been recognized for my volunteer work. Every image showed Frank engaging with people whose trust he was systematically betraying. Your husband identified potential victims through your social connections, Agent Chen continued. Widows, retirees, families dealing with medical crises, people in vulnerable situations who needed financial guidance. He used your reputation and relationships to gain their confidence, then directed them into investment schemes that existed only to fund his criminal activities. The personal violation was more devastating than the financial theft. Frank hadn't just stolen our money, he'd weaponized my friendships, my charity work, my reputation in the community to prey on people I cared about. Every introduction I'd made, every social connection I'd facilitated, had potentially become a pathway for Frank to identify and exploit vulnerable victims. There's something else, Agent Chen said, her voice gentling with what sounded like sympathy. We've been monitoring communications between your husband and Miss Brooks. Some of their conversations specifically discuss you and your relationships with potential victims. She played an audio recording that made me feel physically sick. Frank's voice, casual and amused, describing me to Blanche as perfect cover for their operation. Dorothy's charity work gives us access to exactly the kind of people we need, he was saying. Wealthy, trusting, socially connected but not sophisticated about complex investments. She introduces me as her brilliant husband, and they hand over their life savings without asking difficult questions. Blanche's response was equally chilling. It's almost too easy. They trust her so completely that they assume her husband must be trustworthy too. Do you think she knows what we're really doing? Frank's laugh was cruel. Dorothy. She's too naive and self-absorbed to notice anything beyond her garden parties and book clubs. She thinks she's married to a successful attorney who adores her. The poor woman has no idea she's been an unwitting accomplice to fraud for over 2 years. Listening to my husband mock my intelligence and character while using my relationships to destroy innocent people was more humiliating than discovering his affair. The man I'd loved and supported for 22 years saw me as nothing more than a useful tool for criminal activity. Mrs. Harold, Agent Chen said, after turning off the recording, I want you to understand that your cooperation could save multiple families from financial ruin. But I also need you to know that your husband and Miss Brooks have been planning to frame you if the investigation gets too close to them. She showed me documents Frank had prepared, financial records that would suggest I'd been the mastermind behind the investment fraud, using my social connections to identify victims while Frank unknowingly processed the paperwork. Blanche had even created false emails that purported to show me giving instructions about targeting specific individuals. If we hadn't approached you first, Agent Chen explained, you would have been arrested alongside your husband when we moved to shut down the operation. Frank was planning to claim he'd been manipulated by his ambitious wife who used her social status to facilitate the crimes. The betrayal was complete. Frank wasn't just stealing from me and using me, he was preparing to destroy me entirely if it became necessary to save himself. The man who'd promised to love and protect me had been constructing a scenario where I would spend decades in federal prison for crimes he'd committed. But Frank had made one crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed I would remain the naive, trusting wife he'd been manipulating for years. He had no idea that his own arrogance and cruelty had transformed me into someone capable of matching his strategic thinking and exceeding his capacity for calculated revenge. If Frank wanted to play games with people's lives and futures, he was about to discover that his wife had become a far more dangerous opponent than he'd ever imagined. Working with the FBI required a level of deception I'd never imagined myself capable of. For 3 weeks I continued playing the role of the oblivious wife while systematically gathering evidence that would ensure Frank's complete destruction. Every morning I kissed him goodbye and wished him a good day at the office. Every evening I asked about his cases and listened to his lies with apparent interest. And every day in between, I was methodically building the case that would send him to federal prison. Agent Chen had equipped me with recording devices so sophisticated they were virtually undetectable. A pen that captured audio, a brooch that contained a micro camera, even software for my phone that could record conversations without any visible indication. Frank, who prided himself on his attention to detail, never suspected that his trusting wife had become a federal informant. The first major breakthrough came during one of Frank's business dinners at our home. He'd invited Lionel Ford and 2 other partners from the firm to discuss what he described as expanding our client services portfolio. I played the perfect hostess, serving wine and appetizers while appearing to pay no attention to their conversation. What the hidden recording devices captured was Frank and his partners discussing specific clients by name, detailing exactly how much money they'd stolen from each one, and planning new schemes to target additional victims. The casual way they discussed destroying people's lives was breathtaking in its callousness. "The Williams family trust should be good for another $1 million, Lionel was saying as I refilled his wine glass. "The old man is getting senile, and the daughter trusts us completely. She'll sign anything we put in front of her." Frank laughed, raising his glass in a mock toast. "To trusting clients and complex financial instruments they'll never understand." I smiled and nodded pleasantly, while internally cataloging every detail for my FBI handlers. The Williams family had been friends of my parents for decades. Their daughter Sarah had been in my wedding. Frank wasn't just committing crimes, he was systematically betraying every personal relationship our family had built over generations. Agent Chen had also arranged for me to wear recording equipment during social events, where Frank would inevitably encounter potential victims. The annual Children's Hospital Gala provided the perfect opportunity to document Frank's predatory behavior in real time. I watched him work the room with the skill of a professional con artist, identifying wealthy widows and elderly couples who might be susceptible to his investment schemes. His approach was masterful, expressing sympathy for their losses, sharing stories about how he'd helped other clients in similar situations, gradually building trust through carefully crafted displays of expertise and concern. "Mrs. Patterson," I heard him tell an elderly woman whose husband had died the previous year, "Dorothy and I have been so worried about you since Harold's passing. Managing finances alone can be overwhelming. Perhaps we could schedule some time to review your portfolio, purely as friends, of course." The recording captured Mrs. Patterson's grateful response, her obvious relief at Frank's offer of guidance, her complete trust in the husband of a woman she'd known for years. I wanted to warn her, to protect her from what I knew was coming, but Agent Chen had made it clear that premature intervention could compromise the entire investigation. Instead, I smiled and squeezed Mrs. Patterson's hand, promising to call her soon about lunch, all while knowing that Frank was already calculating how much of her dead husband's life insurance money he could steal. The most damaging evidence came from Frank's own office, where he'd grown careless about document security. Using the access codes he'd given me years ago for emergency situations, I was able to photograph client files, investment documents, and correspondence that detailed the full scope of the criminal operation. The financial records revealed a sophisticated laundering system that moved money through multiple accounts and shell companies before ultimately ending up in accounts controlled by Frank, Blanche, and their co-conspirators. Client funds would be invested in legitimate securities for short periods to generate authentic-looking statements, then gradually siphoned off through management fees and administrative costs that existed only on paper. But the most devastating evidence was Frank's own handwritten notes, found in a locked drawer of his office desk. These weren't official documents, they were his personal planning notes for the criminal enterprise, written in his distinctive handwriting and impossible to deny or explain away. Target widows, 6 missed 18 months after loss, grief makes them vulnerable but inheritance still accessible, one note read. Use Dee's charity connections for introductions, her reputation provides instant credibility. Another note detailed specific clients and their estimated worth. Margaret Reynolds, $800K life insurance, desperate for income. Patterson family lies $2.2 million estate, daughter overwhelmed. Johnson Retirement Fund, $1.4 million, medical expenses creating urgency. Reading Frank's clinical assessment of our friend's vulnerabilities, his calculation of exactly how much money he could steal from each grieving family, was like discovering I'd been married to a sociopath. These weren't crimes of opportunity or desperation, they were methodically planned attacks on people Frank knew were suffering. The final piece of evidence came from Blanche's apartment, where a search warrant executed by Agent Chen's team uncovered detailed records of the money laundering operation. Blanche had kept meticulous documentation of every transaction, every victim, every dollar stolen, apparently as insurance against her criminal partners. Among her files was a document that chilled me to the bone, a detailed plan for framing me as the mastermind of the entire operation. Frank and Blanche had prepared false evidence, forged communications, and even practiced their testimony for how they would claim I'd manipulated them into participating in crimes I'd designed. But they'd made one fatal error in their planning. Every piece of false evidence they'd created to frame me was documented in Blanche's files, complete with dates showing when the fraudulent materials had been prepared. Agent Chen now had proof not only of the original crimes, but of conspiracy to obstruct justice and frame an innocent person. After 6 weeks of gathering evidence, Agent Chen had everything she needed to destroy Frank completely. The case against him was so overwhelming that his conviction was virtually guaranteed. But the most satisfying part wasn't Frank's impending imprisonment, it was knowing that his own arrogance and meticulous planning had provided every piece of evidence needed to ensure his destruction. The Illinois State Bar Association's annual Excellence Awards represented the pinnacle of Frank's professional ambitions. For 23 years, he'd watched other attorneys receive the prestigious Advocate of the Year honor, building his practice and reputation with this moment as his ultimate goal. When the nomination committee selected him for this year's award, Frank's excitement was palpable, and perfectly suited to my plans for his complete humiliation. Frank's selection for the award wasn't coincidental. Agent Chen had worked with prosecutors to ensure that Frank's name was submitted for consideration, knowing that his ego would never allow him to decline such recognition. The ceremony would provide the ideal setting for his arrest, a room full of Chicago's legal establishment, media coverage, and maximum impact for the exposure of his crimes. "Dorothy, this is everything I've worked for," Frank told me as he tried on his new tuxedo, purchased specifically for the ceremony. "The acceptance speech alone will generate enough publicity to expand our client base exponentially." I watched him practice his speech in our bedroom mirror, gesturing grandly as he spoke about integrity in the legal profession, and the sacred trust between attorney and client. The irony was so perfect it felt scripted. Frank would be honoring those principles moments before being arrested for violating them systematically. But the real trap wasn't just Frank's public arrest, it was the financial destruction I'd been orchestrating through the trust fund provisions he'd forgotten about. Stanley Brooks had worked with me to prepare documentation that would be served immediately following Frank's arrest, ensuring that his criminal charges would trigger the infidelity clause before he could attempt any legal maneuvering. "Dorothy," Stanley had explained during our final preparation meeting, "the moment Frank is formally charged with felony fraud, the trust fund provisions activate automatically. Not only does he forfeit his share of the $2.3 million principal, but the restitution clauses mean he becomes liable for repaying every dollar he's stolen, plus penalties and legal costs." The beauty of Frank's original legal document was its comprehensiveness. He'd been so concerned about protecting his assets from a potentially unfaithful wife that he'd created provisions covering not just adultery, but any criminal behavior that reflected poorly on the family's reputation. Financial crimes, professional misconduct, anything that could damage the Harold family name would result in complete forfeiture of trust fund rights. More crucially, the trust fund had grown substantially since its establishment, and Frank's criminal activity meant he would be responsible for repaying not just what he'd stolen from our marriage, but compensating the trust for his forfeiture. The mathematical result was that Frank would owe approximately $4.70 million, money he obviously didn't have, since most of his stolen funds had already been spent or were tied up in frozen accounts. Agent Chen had coordinated the timing perfectly. Frank's arrest would occur during his acceptance speech, ensuring maximum publicity and professional humiliation. Simultaneously, federal agents would be arresting Lionel Ford and executing search warrants at the law firm. By the time Frank realized what was happening, his entire criminal network would be dismantled and his professional life would be destroyed. But I had one additional surprise planned, something Agent Chen didn't know about, because it was purely personal rather than legal. Blanche would be at the award ceremony as Frank's guest, sitting at our assigned table while I played the role of supportive wife one final time. I'd arranged for her to receive a special message during Frank's speech that would ensure she understood exactly how completely she'd been betrayed by her criminal partner. The week before the ceremony, I'd had final conversations with the victims Frank had defrauded through my social connections. Margaret Reynolds, Mrs. Patterson, the Williams family, and 8 other families whose trust Frank had systematically violated. I couldn't undo the damage Frank had caused, but I could ensure they understood that his crimes were being exposed and that restitution would be forthcoming from the trust fund. "Dorothy," Margaret had said when I called to explain the situation, "I can't believe Frank would do something like this. He seemed so concerned about my financial security after Harold died." That conversation, multiplied across every family Frank had victimized, reinforced my determination to ensure his punishment was as public and comprehensive as his crimes deserved. Frank had used my reputation and relationships to prey on vulnerable people. His exposure needed to be equally visible to our entire social circle. The evening of the award ceremony, I dressed in the same black gown I'd worn to our anniversary party, the event where Frank had been cultivating victims while celebrating our marriage. As I applied my makeup and selected jewelry that Frank had probably purchased with stolen money, I felt a sense of completion rather than nervousness. Frank was in his study, making final revisions to his acceptance speech, completely unaware that federal agents were already positioned around the hotel ballroom. He'd spent months planning his moment of professional triumph, never imagining that it would become the setting for his complete destruction. "Are you ready to go, sweetheart?" Frank called out, his voice filled with excitement and anticipation. "I've been ready for this evening for quite some time," I replied, and for the first time in months I was telling my husband the complete truth. The drive to the hotel was quiet, with Frank focused on his speech and me contemplating the justice that was about to unfold. In less than 2 hours, Frank Harold would discover that his brilliant legal mind had created the perfect mechanism for his own destruction, and that the naive wife he'd been manipulating for over 2 years had orchestrated every detail of his downfall. Justice, I reflected as we approached the hotel, sometimes wears an evening gown and a smile. The Palmer House ballroom glittered with Chicago's legal elite. 500 attorneys and judges gathered to celebrate excellence in the profession Frank had spent his career systematically corrupting. I sat at our assigned table, watching Frank work the room with his characteristic confidence, accepting congratulations and making small talk with colleagues who had no idea they were witnessing his final moments of freedom. Blanche had arrived 30 minutes earlier, stunning in a red dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She moved through the crowd with practiced elegance, the perfect accessory for Frank's moment of triumph. What she didn't know was that the envelope in my purse contained photographs and financial records that would destroy any illusions she had about Frank's loyalty to their criminal partnership. "Ladies and gentlemen," the evening's host announced as dinner concluded, "please welcome this year's recipient of the Advocate of the Year Award, Frank Harold, for his unwavering commitment to client service and professional integrity." The applause was thunderous as Frank approached the podium, his face glowing with satisfaction. This was his moment, the public recognition he'd craved throughout his career, validation that his reputation and success were built on solid foundations. He had no idea that federal agents were positioned at every exit, waiting for Agent Chen's signal. "Thank you for this incredible honor," Frank began, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who believed he'd outsmarted everyone around him. "When I started my career 23 years ago, I made a commitment to serve my clients with absolute integrity and unwavering dedication to their financial security." I watched faces in the audience, recognizing judges who'd sat on cases Frank had argued, partners from competing firms who'd referred clients to him, bar association officials who'd trusted him with leadership positions. None of them knew they were listening to a speech about integrity from a man who'd stolen millions from vulnerable families. "The practice of law isn't just about winning cases," Frank continued, warming to his theme. "It's about building trust, protecting the vulnerable, and ensuring that justice serves those who need it most. Every client who walks into my office receives not just legal expertise, but a personal commitment to their well-being and financial future." The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Frank was literally describing the opposite of everything he'd done for the past 2 years, speaking passionately about protecting vulnerable clients while having systematically preyed upon widows and grieving families. His performance was so convincing that even I might have believed him if I hadn't seen the evidence of his crimes. But Frank's speech was about to be interrupted in a way that would ensure his words about integrity and trust would be remembered as the most ironic moment in Chicago legal history. I caught Agent Chen's eye across the room and nodded slightly. She spoke quietly into her radio, and I saw federal agents begin moving toward the ballroom entrances. The net was closing, but Frank was too absorbed in his moment of glory to notice the subtle movements around the room's perimeter. "In closing," Frank said, his voice rising with emotion, "I want to thank my beautiful wife Dorothy, whose unwavering support and brilliant financial mind have made my success possible. Dorothy, please stand so everyone can see the woman who truly deserves this recognition." The spotlight found me as I rose from my seat, and the audience applauded politely. Frank beamed at me from the podium, gesturing for me to join him. This wasn't part of the planned program, but Frank's ego demanded that I share his moment of triumph. As I walked toward the stage, I saw Agent Chen and her team moving into position. Federal agents were now stationed at every exit, their presence still discreet but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. Frank, focused entirely on the applause and admiration, remained oblivious to the closing trap. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said as I reached the microphone, my voice carrying clearly through the ballroom, "before we celebrate tonight, I think everyone should know the truth about the man you've just honored." The confused murmur that rippled through the audience was audible even over the sound system. Frank's expression shifted from pride to confusion to the beginning of alarm as he realized something was very wrong with his carefully planned evening. I opened my purse and withdrew the manila envelope I'd carried for this exact moment. Frank Harold has spent the past 2 years systematically defrauding his clients, stealing money from grieving widows, and using his law practice to operate a criminal enterprise that has destroyed dozens of families. The ballroom erupted in shocked gasps and confused conversation. Frank lunged toward me, his face contorted with rage and panic, but Agent Chen was already moving across the stage with her credentials displayed. "Frank Harold," Agent Chen announced, her voice cutting through the chaos, "you're under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, and multiple counts of elder abuse. You have the right to remain silent." As the handcuffs clicked around Frank's wrists, I turned to Blanche, who sat frozen at our table, her face pale with shock. I walked over and placed the second envelope in front of her, the one containing evidence that Frank had been planning to frame her as the mastermind if their operation was discovered. "You might want to call a lawyer," I told her quietly. "And you should know that Frank was planning to let you take the blame for everything." The room was in complete chaos now, with federal agents conducting arrests while the cream of Chicago's legal community watched in stunned silence. Cameras flashed as reporters who'd come to cover a routine awards ceremony found themselves documenting the arrest of one of the city's most prominent attorneys. Frank was shouting something about his rights and demanding to call his lawyer, but his words were lost in the noise of his collapsing world. As they led him away, he caught my eye one final time, and I saw the exact moment he realized that his naive, trusting wife had orchestrated every detail of his destruction. I remained on the stage watching the man I'd loved and supported for 22 years being led away in handcuffs, and felt nothing but relief that the performance was finally over. The aftermath of Frank's arrest unfolded with the swift precision of a federal operation that had been planned down to the smallest detail. While the ballroom erupted in chaos and confused conversations, Agent Chen's team executed simultaneous raids across Chicago that dismantled the entire criminal network in a single coordinated strike. By midnight, Lionel Ford had been arrested at his Lake Forest home, federal agents seizing computers, financial records, and luxury items purchased with stolen client funds. The law firm's offices were sealed and searched, with investigators carting out boxes of evidence that would take months to fully process. Blanche Brooks, after reading the contents of the envelope I'd given her, immediately contacted a criminal defense attorney and began negotiations for a plea agreement. The Illinois State Bar Association moved with unprecedented speed to suspend Frank's law license, pending the outcome of his criminal trial. The statement they released to the media was devastating in its implications. The allegations against Mr. Harold represent a fundamental betrayal of the trust placed in members of our profession. We are cooperating fully with federal investigators to ensure that justice is served and that affected clients receive appropriate support. But the most immediate and personally satisfying consequence was the activation of the trust fund provisions that Frank had crafted with such arrogant precision. Stanley Brooks had prepared all the necessary documentation in advance, and by 10 a.m. the following morning, Frank had officially forfeited his rights to the $2.3 million trust fund, while becoming personally liable for an additional $2.4 million in restitution and penalties. The mathematics of Frank's destruction were elegant in their simplicity. His criminal activity had triggered every protective clause he'd written into our financial agreements, creating a cascade of liability that would leave him financially ruined even if he somehow avoided prison. The man who'd stolen nearly $1.4 million from our marriage was now legally obligated to pay almost $5 million. He didn't have. The media coverage exceeded my wildest expectations for exposing Frank's hypocrisy. The Chicago Tribune's front-page headline read, "Integrity Award winner arrested for massive fraud," accompanied by a photograph of Frank in handcuffs being led away from the podium where he'd just finished praising his commitment to client welfare. Every major news outlet in the city covered the story, with several noting the bitter irony of Frank's arrest occurring moments after he'd delivered a speech about professional ethics. Legal commentators were particularly fascinated by the trust fund provisions that had turned Frank's own paranoia about unfaithful wives into the instrument of his financial destruction. Harold essentially wrote his own punishment, noted a professor from Northwestern Law School. The infidelity clause he insisted upon has become the most expensive legal document in Chicago history. But beyond the public humiliation and financial ruin, the most devastating consequence for Frank was the complete collapse of his professional reputation. Within 48 hours of his arrest, clients began flooding the courts with malpractice lawsuits, claiming Frank had breached his fiduciary duties even in cases unrelated to the criminal fraud. The law firm immediately moved to distance themselves from Frank's actions, issuing statements about their shock and dismay, while quietly settling potential claims. The personal consequences were equally swift and comprehensive. Frank's arrest triggered immediate asset freezes that left him unable to access funds for bail or legal representation. The $250,000 bail amount seemed modest compared to the millions he'd stolen, but with all his accounts frozen and the trust fund forfeited, Frank couldn't raise the money. He spent his first week after arrest in Cook County Jail, a humbling experience for a man accustomed to luxury hotels and expensive restaurants. Coral and Evelyn flew home from their respective universities immediately after seeing the news coverage. Their reactions perfectly captured the complexity of Frank's betrayal, devastation at their father's crimes, combined with pride in my courage to expose him. "Mom," Coral said as we sat in our kitchen the morning after Frank's arrest, "I can't believe Dad did this to our family, but I'm proud of you for stopping him before he hurt more people." Evelyn's response was more practical, reflecting her business school training. "The trust fund provisions were brilliant legal strategy, Mom. Dad essentially created a self-executing punishment that protects our family's financial future while ensuring he faces consequences for his crimes." The girl's support meant everything to me. confirming that I'd made the right choice in exposing Frank rather than enabling his continued criminal behavior. They understood that protecting our family's integrity and financial security required destroying the man who'd threatened both. Margaret Reynolds called on the second day after Frank's arrest, her voice shaking with emotion. "Dorothy, I watched the news coverage and I can't believe what Frank did to me and so many others. But I want you to know how grateful I am that you found the courage to stop him. You saved other families from losing everything like I did." Similar calls came from every family Frank had victimized through my social connections. Instead of anger at my unwitting role in their targeting, they expressed gratitude that I'd chosen justice over loyalty to a criminal husband. The community that Frank had tried to exploit through my relationships now rallied around me as the woman who'd exposed his predatory behavior. The immediate consequences of Frank's arrest had transformed me from the wife of a respected attorney into the woman who'd brought down one of Chicago's most sophisticated financial predators. It was a reputation I was proud to claim, and one that marked the beginning of a new chapter in my life, one where I would never again be anyone's unwitting accomplice or convenient cover story. The months following Frank's arrest became a careful orchestration of justice and healing, as federal prosecutors worked to ensure that every victim of his crimes received meaningful restitution. The trust fund that Frank had designed to protect his wealth from an unfaithful wife became the primary vehicle for restoring what he'd stolen from vulnerable families across Chicago. Agent Chen coordinated with Stanley Brooks to establish a victim compensation fund that would distribute the $2.3 million trust fund principal, plus recovered assets, to the families Frank had defrauded. The process was remarkably efficient, considering the complexity of tracking money that had been laundered through multiple shell companies and offshore accounts. Margaret Reynolds was the first victim to receive full restitution. When I handed her the check for $847,000, representing her complete life insurance settlement plus interest and damages, she broke down crying in my living room. "Dorothy, I never thought I'd see this money again," she said through her tears. "Frank convinced me it was safely invested, and I've been living on credit cards for 8 months. You didn't just expose his crimes, you saved my life." The Williams family received $1.2 million, allowing their elderly patriarch to remain in the assisted living facility he'd been forced to leave when Frank's investment opportunities disappeared with their family trust. Mrs. Patterson got back her $650,000 retirement fund, plus enough additional compensation to cover the medical bills she'd been unable to pay during the months when Frank claimed her money was temporarily illiquid. But the restoration process extended beyond simple financial reimbursement. Each family that had been victimized received personal letters from me, acknowledging my unwitting role in their targeting and expressing my commitment to ensuring they were made whole. These weren't legal documents, they were personal apologies from a woman who understood that my reputation and relationships had been weaponized against innocent people. The law firm faced its own reckoning, with partners who had been unaware of Frank's criminal activities working to rebuild their professional reputation. They established a client protection fund that provided additional compensation to victims, and implemented new oversight procedures designed to prevent future fraud. Lionel Ford's partnership was dissolved, and his own criminal trial was scheduled for the following year. Blanche Brooks accepted a plea agreement that required her to forfeit all assets purchased with stolen funds and serve 18 months in federal prison. Her cooperation with investigators helped recover an additional $400,000 in hidden assets, money that was immediately added to the victim compensation fund. The broader Chicago legal community responded to Frank's crimes by implementing new ethical guidelines and reporting requirements designed to prevent attorneys from exploiting vulnerable clients. The Illinois State Bar Association established the Harold Case Task Force, named after Frank's scandal, to study how predatory lawyers target grieving families and develop protective measures. My own role in the investigation and prosecution earned recognition from victim advocacy groups across the state. The Chicago Coalition Against Elder Abuse honored me with their annual Justice Award, noting that my courage in exposing Frank's crimes had protected countless potential future victims from financial exploitation. "Dorothy Harold chose justice over loyalty," the coalition's president said during the award ceremony. Her willingness to cooperate with federal investigators despite personal cost demonstrates the kind of moral courage our society needs to protect its most vulnerable members. The award ceremony took place in the same Palmer House ballroom where Frank had been arrested, and I wore the same black gown I'd worn that night. But this time the evening celebrated justice achieved rather than justice delayed, healing rather than destruction, truth rather than deception. As I stood at the podium where Frank had delivered his hypocritical speech about integrity, I reflected on how completely our roles had reversed. Frank was serving a 12-year federal sentence in a minimum security prison, his law license permanently revoked, his financial future destroyed by the very legal provisions he'd created to protect himself. Meanwhile, I had emerged from his betrayal as a woman respected for her courage, trusted by my community, and finally free to live authentically rather than as an unwitting accessory to someone else's crimes. The restoration phase wasn't just about returning stolen money, it was about rebuilding trust, repairing relationships, and proving that even the most sophisticated criminals eventually face consequences for their actions. Frank's victims had been made whole, his criminal network had been dismantled, and justice had been served with the precision he'd once brought to his own legal practice. The irony was perfect. Frank's greatest professional achievement had been creating the legal framework for his own complete destruction. The woman who emerged from Frank's betrayal was fundamentally different from the one who had discovered that lipstick stain on his burgundy suit. For 22 years I had defined myself through my relationship to Frank, as his supportive wife, his social partner, his behind-the-scenes strategist. The destruction of our marriage had forced me to discover who Dorothy Harold was when she wasn't serving as an accessory to someone else's ambitions. 18 months after Frank's sentencing, I stood in the lobby of a gleaming office building in downtown Chicago, preparing for a meeting that would have been impossible during my marriage. I was there as the founder and president of the Vulnerable Client Protection Initiative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to preventing financial predators from exploiting grieving families and elderly victims. The organization had grown from my personal experience with Frank's crimes into a statewide advocacy group that worked with law enforcement, bar associations, and victim services to identify and stop elder financial abuse. We provided training for attorneys on ethical obligations, education for families about protecting vulnerable relatives, and direct support for fraud victims navigating the complex process of recovery. "Mrs. Harold," said the receptionist at the Attorney General's office, "they're ready for you in the conference room." I was meeting with state prosecutors to discuss legislation that would strengthen penalties for attorneys who exploit client relationships for personal gain. The Harold Bill, as it had become known in legal circles, would create mandatory reporting requirements and establish severe sanctions for attorneys found guilty of targeting vulnerable clients. Walking into that conference room, surrounded by prosecutors and legislators who sought my expertise on financial fraud prevention, I realized how completely my identity had transformed. I was no longer the woman who arranged charity fundraisers to advance her husband's career. I had become someone whose opinion carried weight because of what I'd survived and overcome. The consulting work had begun almost accidentally. Other attorneys facing similar situations reached out for advice about investigating suspected fraud, understanding financial records, or coordinating with federal authorities. Word spread through Chicago's legal community that Dorothy Harold knew how to dismantle sophisticated financial crimes and protect innocent victims from predatory lawyers. Within 6 months, I had established Harold Consulting, specializing in forensic investigation of professional misconduct and white-collar crime. My first major case involved a prominent accountant who was stealing from elderly clients through fake investment schemes, remarkably similar to Frank's operation. The skills I'd developed investigating my own husband, patience, attention to detail, and an intimate understanding of how professionals exploit trust, proved invaluable in exposing other criminals. "Dorothy," said State's Attorney Lisa Chen during our meeting, "your work has fundamentally changed how we approach these cases. The Harold Bill will protect thousands of families from the kind of exploitation your husband practiced." But the most profound transformation was personal, rather than professional. For the first time in my adult life, I was making decisions based on my own values and priorities, rather than supporting someone else's ambitions. The house in Kenilworth had been sold, with proceeds going to victim restitution and my daughter's education funds. I'd purchased a smaller but elegant townhouse in Lincoln Park, decorated entirely according to my own tastes rather than Frank's preferences or social expectations. Coral and Evelyn had watched this transformation with a mixture of pride and amazement. "Mom," Evelyn had said during one of our weekly dinners, "I never realized how much of yourself you gave up for Dad's career. You're so much more confident and decisive now." Their observation was accurate. The woman who had once deferred financial decisions to her attorney husband now advised federal prosecutors on complex fraud cases. The woman who had planned social events to advance Frank's networking goals now designed public policy to protect vulnerable victims. The woman who had trusted completely and been betrayed systematically now helped others recognize and escape similar exploitation. The irony wasn't lost on me that Frank's criminal behavior had ultimately freed me to become more than I'd ever been as his wife. His betrayal had destroyed the false foundation of our marriage, but it had also revealed strengths and capabilities I'd never been allowed to fully develop. Standing in that conference room, discussing legislation that would bear my name and protect countless families from financial predators, I understood that Frank's greatest crime hadn't been stealing money or betraying our marriage. His greatest crime had been trying to diminish me, to keep me small and dependent, to prevent me from becoming the woman I was always capable of being. But even that crime had ultimately failed. Frank was serving his sentence in federal prison, while I was building a new life that honored both justice and personal growth. 2 years after Frank's arrest, I found myself in a place I never could have imagined during those dark months of discovery and investigation. It was a crisp October morning, exactly 24 months since I'd stood at that awards ceremony podium and exposed my husband's crimes to Chicago's legal establishment. Today I was returning to the same Palmer House ballroom, but this time as the keynote speaker for the Illinois Bar Association's Ethics and Professional Responsibility Conference. The irony was delicious. The same room where Frank had been arrested while accepting an award for integrity now hosted me as I spoke about the moral courage required to expose professional misconduct, even when it meant destroying your own family's carefully constructed life. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, looking out at an audience of attorneys who remembered Frank's dramatic downfall. 2 years ago in this room, I learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to enable someone's worst behavior. The audience was completely engaged as I detailed my journey from unsuspecting wife to federal informant to victim advocate. I spoke about the warning signs I'd missed, the trust I'd placed in someone who didn't deserve it, and the decision to choose justice over loyalty when those two values came into conflict. But the speech wasn't really about Frank's crimes or even my investigation. It was about the transformation that follows when we stop allowing fear to dictate our choices and start building lives based on authentic values rather than convenient illusions. The woman who discovered those bank statements was someone who had spent 22 years as a supporting character in someone else's story, I explained. She was accomplished but subordinate, intelligent but deferential, capable but contained. Frank's betrayal forced me to become the protagonist of my own life for the first time in my adult existence. After the speech, several attorneys approached me with their own stories of suspicious colleagues, questionable financial arrangements, and ethical dilemmas they'd been afraid to address. The conversation that emerged was exactly what I'd hoped for. A community of professionals committed to protecting their profession's integrity by confronting misconduct rather than ignoring it. That evening, I returned to my Lincoln Park townhouse and called Coral and Evelyn for our weekly family check-in. Both daughters were thriving in ways that made me proud of the example I'd set by choosing difficult truths over comfortable lies. Coral had graduated from medical school and was beginning her residency in pediatric oncology, inspired partly by watching me advocate for vulnerable victims. "Mom," she said, during our call, "seeing you find your voice and use it to help people changed how I think about my own responsibilities as a doctor." Evelyn had finished her MBA and accepted a position with a nonprofit focused on financial literacy education for seniors. "You showed me that real success isn't about climbing someone else's ladder," she explained. "It's about building something meaningful that reflects your own values." As I sat in my living room that night, surrounded by books I'd chosen, artwork I loved, and furniture that reflected my personal taste rather than social expectations, I reflected on the strange gift Frank's betrayal had ultimately become. Yes, he'd stolen our money, destroyed our marriage, and shattered the illusion of our perfect life. But in doing so, he'd also freed me from a prison I hadn't even recognized. The prison of defining myself through someone else's achievements and living according to someone else's priorities. The trust fund clause that Frank had insisted upon to protect his assets from an unfaithful wife had indeed worked exactly as designed. It had protected the family's wealth from the spouse who proved unfaithful. Frank had simply been too arrogant to imagine he might be that spouse. The $2.3 million I'd inherited from the trust fund forfeiture wasn't just financial security, it was the foundation for building a life that honored my own values and utilized my own talents. I'd invested part of it in my consulting business, donated substantial amounts to victim advocacy organizations, and ensured that Coral and Evelyn's education funds remained intact despite their father's crimes. But the real inheritance wasn't monetary. It was the knowledge that I possessed the strength, intelligence, and moral courage to face whatever challenges life presented. Frank had tried to convince me I was dependent on his guidance and protection. His betrayal had proven that the opposite was true. He had been the one who needed me, my reputation, my connections, and my unwitting compliance to enable his criminal behavior. Now, as I prepared for bed in my own home, living my own life, building my own legacy, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades: complete contentment with who I was, and excitement about who I was still becoming. Frank would serve 10 more years in federal prison, followed by lifetime supervision and financial obligations he could never fulfill. I would continue building a career and life that brought meaning, purpose, and authentic satisfaction. Justice, I had learned, wasn't just about punishment for wrongdoing. It was about creating space for truth, growth, and genuine happiness to flourish where lies and manipulation had once dominated. The perfect life had been a beautiful deception. The real life I was creating was messy, challenging, and absolutely mine. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.